So, welcome everyone. My name is Frédéric Passeron and I'm part of the HPE Dev team, and we are supporting these HPE Dev Talks. So I can see many new names in the audience and I'm very happy to see them. I'm pretty sure that they are coming from the Aruba side of the house. So before we start the Dev Talk, there will be a few house items to go with. So first, I'm very happy to welcome Alvin, which will be our speaker today, and he'll be delivering a session on programming with Aruba CX pyaoscx Python SDK. Not so easy to pronounce, so maybe you'll spell it better than I do. So this is the 37th Dev Talk that we are hosting, and so we've been there for more than a year now. And if you are new to the program and new to the Dev Talk, there is a web portal that you can actually check out. So this is the link to the developer website, and this is the page for the Dev Talks. There you will be able to find the calendar, meaning that you will see the forthcoming session as well as the past one. You will see the registration link to actually allow registration to the forthcoming Dev Talks, and you will see also the replay links for all the Dev Talks that happened in the past and that you have no chance to actually attend. The next one will be taking place on October 27th. It will be dedicated to a partner, an Emerald partner, which is GoPaddle. And from what I heard from my colleague Didier, this is a PaaS provider. So this will be a Dev Talk with no hands-on, I suppose, and it will be a Dev Talk only. On contrary, this one obviously today will be held with hands-on. So for those of you who are quick enough, you'll be able to reach out to the workshop page. And if some of you don't know about the workshop, I'll be showing you what it looks like. So this is our workshop page, and this is a web portal that we have developed and that we are maintaining, and that is hosting all the different workshops that we are making available to the audience and to the community, the HPE Dev community overall, internal or external. These workshops are free, completely free. They are available 24/7. And they are allowing you to interact through our Jupyter notebooks on different subjects, like obviously today Aruba and this Python SDK, but it could be also some Kubernetes 101, some Emerald dedicated workshops, data fabric. It could be infrastructure related with the ILO and the Redfish protocol. There are also some GreenLake VMAS API related workshops that I introduced lately. And you can see that within the page we have a category lineup, so from the popular ones, the open source related, the Emerald, or infrastructure related. For the one that we are looking at, you can go into the latest and you will see that as we added this workshop today, it appears on top of the page. To register for the workshop is fairly simple. You just click on the register button. You will have to enter your company name, your full name, your email address. You agree with the terms and conditions of our workshops, which is to say that there is a 4-hour window allocated to you to run the workshop, and then you just click on the register button. In the background, the automation will take place and the magic will occur, I would say, providing you within a minute or so some emails with the link to reach out to the notebooks and the credentials necessary to actually log into the page. At the end of each workshop, you will see that there is a survey, and we will ask you kindly to actually fill up the survey to provide us with some feedbacks. Should you be willing to contribute to our program, to the HPE Dev program overall, the Pan HPE program, I would say, we have a dedicated Slack channel with which you can interact. So you can ask questions to our different developers that are part of the team and the community. So there are dedicated channels for Aruba, as you probably have, for HPE Dev, for Primera, storage, Nimble, infrastructure, and so on. There are many different Slack channels that you can reach out to and ask questions to. We also created an Ask HPE Dev community channel that you can use to interact with us and talk to us. We're also providing blogs on a regular basis. So if you go back to the HPE Dev .io website, so the developer.hpe.com website, you will see that there is a blog section in which we are providing on a regular basis, I would say weekly, new technical blogs on dedicated subjects around automation, DevOps subjects, and so on. As you can see today, we are delivering Dev Talks, and we are also providing what we call mention learns. So the mention learns are publicly available type of technical talks. There are more, I would say, subject agnostic and industry agnostic than the Dev Talks. In the Dev Talks, the audience being internal HPE employees and partners. The Dev Talks are just open to everyone, and we are actually asking you to invite your customers should they be interested in some of the subject. So these are all the links that I was talking about. With that being said, I will leave the stage to Alvin and wish you a very good session.
Thank you very much, Fred. Today is an introduction to the pyaoscx v2 Aruba Python SDK. Thank you very much for attending. As Fred mentioned, for the first 20 of you, you actually registered and are able to run the workshop yourself with me. For those that are following afterwards, you might have received an email saying currently they're full. But this replay, or this recording, I should say, will help you walk through this workshop. Again, also, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and Fred will relay them to me. For those of us, especially on the Aruba side, welcome, that have not seen this. This first run through obviously talks to you about the Jupyter Notebook and the Welcome to the Hack Shack. If this is your first foray into Jupyter Notebook, as I mentioned, there are several excellent prerequisites or pre-workshops that I would suggest prior to this one that Fred and his team have done. One is to even get you started with Jupyter Notebooks. But as for this session, we're going to assume that the users of this session and this workshop have some experience with Python. So that's why I listed some prerequisites to understanding Python with Introduction to Python Programming, as well as the API 101. That way you kind of know a little bit about Python already and a little bit about APIs. If you don't know too much about Python, don't worry, hang on. We'll be able to walk you through these. I tried to make this as clean and easy as possible. Of course, feedback is always welcome. Generally, there won't be any slides in addition to this. It'll just be what we have on the workshop. And the lab flow basically will go through where each cell block that has code in it, you could actually run it, you could edit it yourself, and we'll see that as we go along. So this is intended to be kind of a shorter Python session. Some of the workshops that we've done in the past for partners, customers, and internal have been several hours long, but for here we'll keep this within that hour time frame. With that, you should be seeing my screen, and I'll jump right past this README into this Aruba Lab section right here. So as I mentioned, this is an intro to pyaoscx v2. So even I struggle to walk through that sometimes. And what this is Aruba's Python SDK for the AOSCX switching line. And this is the wired section of that. And so we've created this Python SDK to help interact with the APIs around it, really make it easier to program for it as well. And this is essentially also the foundation for some of our other frameworks, such as Ansible. I see that there's mention of things such as Ansible playbooks and such. There are things along those lines that can help you configure. In fact, we intend to have a workshop based off of the Ansible side. But for now, yeah, the pyaoscx v2 is the SDK that is used as a foundation for a lot of our frameworks for the CX side going forward. Really, this will walk you through utilizing v2, as well as get you started with a couple different workflows to really automate your configuration and your editing and changing of the CX switches. So I mentioned v2 a lot, and that's because this is a brand new version that we just had a few weeks ago. In fact, this workshop itself is hot off the presses. Thank you very much to Fred and his team to make that happen. And so if you're familiar with the pyaoscx v1 SDK, you'll notice that version is very script-like. It's very function-based. And v1 had minimal objects and didn't have easy ways to establish the current state of your script. pyaoscx v2 redesigns this, and it uses objects to make it more robust and easier to make function calls without having to pass a ton of arguments that you might have had to do in V1. Over here is a link, and actually, if you were to click on it, it would give you this this GitHub page where we have pyaoscx. It is public, so yourself as anyone can access this and see this. And in fact, if you were interested in V1, you can actually look at some of the previous releases and essentially just do the V1 call. So you have the capability to do that. But keep in mind that this one is a V2 focused workshop, and V2 is not backwards compatible to V1. So this is where this workshop will come into play. And also for those that are running the workshop here, we have a lab infrastructure that utilizes the CX OVAs. Again, thanks to Fred and his team for making that work. With that in mind, these OVAs do not have all the hardware capabilities of an actual switch, such as you'll only see 6 ports versus the 24, 32, 48, etc. So keep that in mind as you run through this. Additionally, as we go through it, if you have your own CX switch at home, you could actually, that is connectable and reachable via the internet. You also have the capability to kind of copy these cells into your own workstation if you wanted to, and change the IP address and run it that way. Excellent. So first task is setting an import service skeleton. So before we do that, I wanted to make sure that we kind of understand what we currently have right now. We have the OVAs, the pyaoscx v2 SDK is already installed, and this will interact with the Aruba switches via those APIs. And so this first cell over here, this is just going to talk about the imports for the skeleton that we want to utilize. This is, we're setting up the framework for a skeleton to where you could use this skeleton for any future scripts that you want to run for CX. By the end of this task, you'll be able to actually just copy this skeleton into your own script, make any adjustments, and be able to utilize it for your own programming. And so these are some of the libraries that we're going to use in this workshop. One that I generally recommend is this urllib3, primarily because depending on how you have your SSL connections and SSH connections to your switch, you're going to get some warnings. It's not going to stop you, but it'll give you some warnings. And so by having this turns off the warnings. And so this block right here, this cell is actually code. So this is where I can actually hit play and it would run stuff. But in this case, we don't actually have any output, but trust me, this cell ran. So for the next task, as we go into logging in and logging out of the switch, you'll actually start to see some interaction, right? So for 1.2, we're going to set the parameters necessary to create a session object, and we'll use that to log into the switch. And this is already where we start to see a difference between V1 and V2. Previously, we would just make a login call, and you just have to save that session as a quark for those that are familiar with Python. In this case, we actually have a session object that's instantiated, and we are able to keep that object and pass that information along to future calls. And that's actually what's keeping the session information. That way, we don't have to use double asterisk keyword arguments in order to keep passing it like we used to in pyaoscx v1. So one other thing that I always recommend is once you open a session and log in, set up a try block to run a couple of print statements for the output. The try block is actually what we suggest for all of our Python scripts interacting with our CX switches, primarily because after the try block, we can run a finally block that logs us out of the switch. That way, especially as we're testing and coding, we don't want to run and create a bunch of sessions, and then your switch is going to be locked up because there's too many open sessions. You know, whether it be 6 sessions or less, or depending on what type of switch you have and the firmware version, you don't want to be locked out. And so the finally block, no matter what happens in that try block, the finally block will always execute. And that's why I want to put that log out there. So that's why it's important to end your workflows with a log out in that finally session to prevent the switch from having too many of those open sessions. There is a command to close all the sessions if you have access to the switch. For this workshop and your interaction with OVAs, unfortunately, you don't have the capability to SSH to the switch. So a lot of our interaction will be happening through this programming cell. So This is actually the login and log out skeleton that we have over here. You can see we've got the imports at the beginning as well as the URL table. One thing that we have as part of the session is a version. This is actually the API version of the switch. With the latest 10.8 release, we actually also have a V10.08, which is backwards compatible to V10.04. And so that's, but we can keep this as V10.04. The pyaoscx v2 supports V10.04 APIs and later for the CX switches. And the switch IP that you have over here is actually auto-generated for those that are new to establish with your infrastructure for this Jupyter notebook. But if you were to copy and paste this into your own, laptop or workstation, this is essentially where you would change the switch IP, you would change the username and password to match your own home setup, and this should work just fine as well. So that's another pro about having these cells, because you can actually interact with them by typing and such. So this is great. Again, the IP username password may look different on your setup for your workshop, but that's because it's generated through this infrastructure that Fred and his team has put up. So we'll see that the session object basically has IP, username, password as part of it. Or actually, the session object will just take the IP as well as the version, but then we're going to use the open call with the username and password, and we're going to print out this logging into the switch. That way, we kind of have a status as to what's happening over here. Another thing about this pyaoscx v2 is if you enable logging as part of your code, you'll actually see a lot more of this information that it spits out. But for our standard out, we're just going to keep it as is, and we'll do print out statements just to help us out over here. And as I mentioned, we're going to have a try block to do a bunch of code. We'll essentially use an except block to catch any of those errors, and we'll have a finally block, and we'll see that this session.close, this s.close, which is that session variable that we have over here, we're going to close this. So no matter what happens in that try and accept, we'll always log out of the switch with this. And so for those of you that are new to Jupyter Notebook, as I mentioned, you click onto the cell and you can actually run this play, or you could also right click and stuff, but I'll run play over here. And now we actually can see an output. And so we can actually match this up against logging into that switch, which we put over here. By this point, we should now be logged into the switch, and hello world. In fact, as I mentioned, we could actually change this to your name, and by running again, I can now see that this output has that. So this is a great quick way to see how the skeleton and the logging in and logging out works. So if all is correct, you'll start to see this information. So hopefully you're doing well so far. The next task is really where the meat of this workshop comes into play. This is essentially where we talk about an open granulated approach versus imperative factory approach. And so the way the pyaoscx v2 is structured, it allows for two different ways to create and configure settings with the switch API through the use of objects. Like I mentioned, this is a lot more object oriented. In the open granulated approach, we're focusing on the objects we want to change, such as a VLAN object or an interface object. Using factories, though, that type of method, we're looking at switch configuration as a whole and the use of a concept of an object factory. And so I'm not going to get too deep into the design principles behind and patterns behind Python and programming and coding. There's tons of literature around that, but it's useful to understand what I mean by a factory at a high level, at least. Factory is a creational design pattern that is used to create implementations of a common interface. It separates the process of creating an object from the code that depends on the interface of the object, instead of using multiple conditional if-else statements as an example. During the script, by using factories, you have this common interface. It'll simplify the code so much so, and it lets like the subclasses or sub-objects determine whether this object needs to be instantiated or not. And you'll actually see this in play as we go through this task. So this first part will start by utilizing this open granulated approach to creating an object. This is where we'll start creating a VLAN object and validate that it was created using the open granulated approach. So the VLAN object constructor has several different parameters requiring the session, the VLAN ID, and other optional parameters that can be passed into the keyword arguments. More information of this class can be found through this link. This actually will take us to that GitHub that I showed earlier. And for this upcoming exercise, there are certain optional parameters that we're going to be passing into that, right? So one other thing that I'll mention is for some of these tasks, I have kind of like a skeleton and shell for you to make some changes based off of this exercise request. And later on, you can actually see that there's a triple dot that has the answer. And so for those of you that are actually following along, feel free to kind of play around with this. There are a couple of things to keep in mind. So for this exercise, we'll be using the constructor with parameters VLAN, and it has a session, VLAN ID, name, and voice. You can actually kind of use what we did for session as an example. And these parameters, as I mentioned, sessions for the variable holding the session data. The VLAN ID is an integer for the VLAN ID number you're creating on this OVA, on the switch. The name is a string for the name of the VLAN. Don't forget to use quotes around the whole string, like VLAN 100, that's a string object. And a voice is a Boolean, true or false, to determine whether or not this particular VLAN is a voice VLAN or not. And so, as I mentioned, the code section afterwards has an example right over here. I won't show it just yet because I wanted to give you some time, but this is essentially the shell that we have. As I mentioned in the exercise, we're going to be filling in this line in particular to create a VLAN object. And so we have this VLAN 100 variable name. This is to kind of hint that why not use VLAN 100. Now, keep in mind that if you are doing this multiple times, if you're running it multiple times, and you're trying to create that VLAN and you're getting a 500 error when running this code, there may already be a VLAN already on this switch. And part of this is with this open granulated approach because we didn't do any error checking. Basically, if you're making an API call on the switch to create a VLAN that's already there, it'll be like, hey, you can't do that. So that's why you might get a 500 error. So for this, I'll give some time, but if you also wanted to look right into the answer, that's where you could open up this triple dot, click that, and this will have it. And so, for the sake of time, and if this is a recording, you can pause here before I go on. We can start typing it in here. So this, as I mentioned, we could type in here if you want, or if you want to look at the answers, we could actually go into here and run it. And so this is the answer that I'm looking for. However, you can have several different iterations or variations, I should say. Instead of VLAN 100, you could be trying to create VLAN 200, just as long as you're passing in this session object, which is this one that was created earlier. I'm putting name equals to specify and define that parameter that we're passing in as VLAN 100, and we're creating this to be a voice VLAN. That way we can see that the voice VLAN. And so one thing that you might notice with this open granulated approach that I have even in this shell over here is that we have a VLAN 100.apply. And that's actually one of the things that's new with the pyaoscx v2, in that when we're creating these objects, we're kind of creating it on our own script. We're instantiating on the script, but we haven't pushed it to the switch. We haven't applied it to the switch yet. And that's what this method is doing. When we do VLAN 100.apply, that's actually when it's kind of applying these configuration settings to the switch. And so if I were to run this cell, now that it has that information, we can see that it logged into the switch. And it says that we should be logged in, and it's now logging out of the switch. Not very helpful output, but the good news is we didn't get an error, right? So that's something that we'll keep in mind and something that we'll take into the next exercise. As I mentioned earlier, though, what happens if I run this again? Because what I did right now is I created a VLAN 100, I pushed it to the switch. If I run this again, I'm going to actually get an error. And so the reason why is because I'm now creating a VLAN 100 again, I'm pushing it over there, and the switch is saying, whoa, I already have a VLAN 100, right? And so keep in mind, pyaoscx v2 is something that we are currently updating. We're adding more features, functionalities, and documentation. And so we'll also add a little more like one of the requests we had is to have better feedback as far as that goes. But in the meantime, we actually could edit our script to talk about the VLAN changes, to print some things out to yourself and the user. That way we can understand whether or not things are successful. In fact, when you're running this apply method that I was mentioning, you'll actually get a return of a true or false because it's a Boolean return. So if you don't have the capability to access the switch at CLI and do a show run on that, you could actually kind of run other commands such as this VLAN get all, which is this next exercise. So over here, this is similar to what we had before. We have this block of imports. We have this session information, even have the same printouts to log in. However, this is to print out. Well, first I should say this VLAN object, I'm going to get all, which is one of the methods that we have for this VLAN object. And then I'm going to print all the keys of that VLAN. So this way I can actually print out and see what is currently on this switch. I have an example here of what it could look like if you're on a real switch. But for this case, if I run this right now, I can see that currently there is a 1 and 100. One thing I forgot to mention is the way that the API returns information and such like that. When we're making API calls to the CX switch, that actually gives JSON information back. So if you're familiar with JSON, you know that you're dealing with most of the time lists and dictionaries, and that's why in this case I'm printing just the keys of the all VLANs, because the values for this are going to be objects. In fact, like I said, we have the capability here to kind of play around with it and run it ourselves. If I wanted to just print all the VLANs like this, I can see that I have the key and of the VLAN ID and the value of a reference to an object, right? And so that's why I found it useful to just print out the keys, since the object reference is not that useful for what we want to see, at least for readability, right? Great. So I just showed you using get all is kind of how we're going to print and see the VLAN outputs, see that information. Now that we have that way to retrieve all the VLANs on the switch, this is where, when you're using this open granulated approach, we're going to add some conditionals to help create output based on the information that we are getting. So this next exercise creates a block of code that will check if the VLAN 100 is already created on the switch. If that VLAN exists, we'll delete it prior to running the create method. That way, earlier when I ran it twice, it gave me an error. In this case, I'm going to delete it if I see it, and then I'll run through that creation section again. And so in the future, but for now, we're gonna do the delete and fill in this logic. So in order to delete a VLAN object must first be created in the Python script, and then because that's actually creating it in the script, and then when you run the delete method, you're essentially telling you're labeling it as a method as information for that VLAN to be deleted. And we're going to put this inside an if condition. That way, the block will first check to see whether or not this VLAN exists. If it does exist, then we'll actually do this delete. Otherwise, you'll print a line saying, it doesn't exist, right? And so, without the logic to handle this existing VLANs, if the API tries to add a VLAN that already exists, it'll return with a 500 error like I showed earlier. And so this is a way to start working the logic around that. So over here, we can see that I've got same intro, same version, and the try block again is essentially what's being changed and important for what we have. I'm doing a get all here to check for a list of all of the VLANs. And then I'm going to print all those VLAN keys just so I have a list of all the VLANs currently on there. That's for my own output, my own visibility. And then I have this if statement. Now, this if statement is missing the conditional, and this is where this part of the exercise is, where you would type some information in based on that. And what we're going to do is we're going to fill this logic to where if the VLAN X, or if this VLAN exists, then we're going to run a delete. And so in this case, we are looking for if all understand VLANs, oops, sorry. So we're checking this list of all VLANs, and we're looking for VLAN 100. So if 100 is in all VLANs, then we're going to print that 100 already exists. And now we need to actually create that VLAN object on the Python script before we could run this delete, right? And so similar to how we created and instantiated a VLAN, in this case, all that we need is just kind of like the VLAN ID. And so we'll be passing in the session info and VLAN ID. And honestly, for this VLAN information, you could actually add other information too, but because this is the same as before, we're creating a VLAN where, oops, sorry, VLAN object. We're creating a VLAN and running it like this and such. And so this is where we're creating a VLAN with ID 100. To be honest, for the other information of the VLAN, that's not as necessary if we're going to delete, because we just need to know that, hey, this VLAN of ID 100 is going to be deleted. And this is where it will be running this VLAN.delete method over here. Then we're going to print all the VLANs keys just to see what we have afterwards. Else we want to do a print, right? We want to do a print line over here to say that, hey, VLAN 100, oops, or clan, VLAN 100 does not exist on the switch. This way, that if it doesn't exist, we'll print this out. If it does exist, then we're going to go through and delete it. And so this is my type, and over here, the triple dots kind of has the answer. I'll go over here and look into what I wrote over here, very similar to what I had up there, where essentially printing out VLAN already exists, checking if 100 is in all the VLANs, creating a VLAN object with just a VLAN ID of 100, and then deleting it. And so I'm going to run this one, and we can see. So this runs through it. By this point, we should be logged into the switch, checking all the VLANs. I see a 1, a 100. VLAN 100 does exist. We're going to remove it. And now we print it again, which is this second print, and we see there's just the 1. So this is how you delete. Basically, you have to create an object with ID for VLANs at least, and then run the delete method, and that's how you do it. So if I were to run this again, because of the conditional that we put earlier, we'll see that right from the start, it sees that it's just VLAN 1 there. VLAN 100 does not exist on the switch, and so that's what it prints out. So we know that our conditional worked, which is great. This is this next task, and if I wanted to run the previous exercise, I could run this right after and have a fun little loop of testing out and playing with that output. And so here's another output, example output for if you have an actual switch that you're playing around with instead of the OVAs. You might have multiple different VLANs, but in this case, we want to delete 100. And so the first list has all these different VLANs. Second list does not have VLAN 100. And of course, logging out of the switch. So, okay, great. Next, we're going to go into the open granulated approach to update. So now we know how to create a VLAN or an object. We know how to delete a VLAN object. Now we want to look at updating an object, right? So updating is important. And for those of you that aren't familiar too much with the Aruba CX API, currently as of 10.8, the API does not have a patch feature. There are gets, posts, puts, and deletes. And so for a lot of our updates, and you'll see this in our pyaoscx v1, we have to get information, and then we take that information, make some adjustments to it, then put that whole block of JSON data as part of our output. And so it's much easier with this pyaoscx v2 using this either the open granulated approach or the factory imperative approach or the factory design. But for now, we'll go through the open granulated approach. And so with this, we have the capability of retrieving the settings of an existing VLAN object. And earlier I mentioned that V2 has more of an easier time of handling the state because of the fact that we have this object instantiated that we can actually fill in that information based off of a get. And so then we can modify the attributes directly, modify the object attributes. Earlier, that VLAN 100 was created as a voice VLAN optionally. That code has rolled into this exercise, so you don't have to retype all that. But for this next task, we want to change that voice VLAN to false. So earlier we did a voice attribute of true. Well, now we want to change it to false. And to do that, we're going to create, after we create this VLAN again, we're going to create a temporary VLAN, that VLAN X, for VLAN 100, kind of like what we did for delete. But now we're going to use a get method to retrieve the data of that VLAN and put it into that temporary information. So we'll print out that VLAN voice attribute next. So over here, we'll see that there is same intro blocks. We'll skip right past that and go right into the try blocks. So I do keep all this printout information just to kind of give us our own status check. We could always change this or delete it when you want to run it. But first, we'll check to see what are the current VLANs. What are the VLANs on the switch? Earlier, because these cells, I should have kind of talked about this earlier. These cells are all interacting with the same OVA, and so what we did in the previous cell block, ran on the previous cell block, will be affected by all of the other cell blocks after and preceding and such. So we deleted it in the last exercise. So we want to create this if statement to where if there isn't a VLAN 100 on there, let's print this out and let's add it. Let's create it. Like this is very similar to what we had earlier, right? And so this is where, this is where essentially we're creating it with a VLAN voice true, and we're applying it to then apply it to that. And as Fred mentioned in the chat, each student that has registered for the workshop and is running it with me, you have your own OVA, but each of your cells will interact with your dedicated student OVA. So you don't have to worry about kind of cross contamination. So, okay, so to the exercise over here, we're creating a VLAN object, similar to what I showed before. We have passing in a session, passing in that ID of 100, and then we're going to run a get to gather all the information. Now we want to, over here, modify the internal attributes on that. And so this is where we basically want to make some changes to VLAN 100 and apply it. Now, again, if you're looking at the recording, this is where you can pause and play through it yourself. But for the interest of time, I will kind of walk through the answer right down here, because this is where we have the temporary VLAN that we want to finish the information. And this is where we want to actually give it that info down here. So let's open up this answer here. And so this is the answer for this VLAN update example, to where we have the VLAN 100, we have that get information, and now we're changing the voice to false. So this is where we're taking that voice attributes that we set earlier, in fact, earlier over here, from true, and now we're instead making it false, okay? If it was, oh, sorry, one thing to mention is I put this in the if VLAN 100 does apply. This is because it returns that true or false based off of what, whether it successfully puts that information, successfully apply that information to the switch or not. And so the VLAN 100.apply is running within this conditional, and whether or not it's updated, that's where you get true or false. So if it did update, this is where you print a VLAN 100 updated. And then afterwards, we're going to create a temporary VLAN object and validate that, hey, it now has that false voice VLAN down here, right? And so we made a VLAN 100 again with a voice attribute false. We applied it, and now we're creating a temporary VLAN, setting it to 100, running a get to gather that information currently on the switch, and we're seeing what the attribute is. So that's what the status over here. So if I were to run this, we can walk through it and see. First, it's going through the top, checking for a switch of all VLANs. It sees that it does not exist, so it's adding it. Then it would create the VLAN 100, set that attribute to, do a get to make sure it's up, basically all the information, kind of like a clone of the information that's currently on the switch. except now we're changing the voice attribute to false, and now we're applying it. And if that's successful, we'll say it was VLAN 100 was updated, and that's exactly what happened here. Then we created a temporary VLAN. We ran that yet again, so we kind of gathered that information that's on the switch, put it on the temporary VLAN, and we're outputting that information over here just to check to make sure that, hey, we ran an apply, we updated that VLAN voice. Now let me do a get on that VLAN, see what exactly it says. And it does says that VLAN 100 voice is false now. So this is how, a roundabout way of we're updating the VLAN and we're doing a get to validate that update. We're validating that that information is now voice has a false and logging on the switch as usual. And of course we have the output. So this kind of runs through a lot of Python logic. And for this workshop, obviously, it might seem a little roundabout, but that's where when I go into the factory approach, we can see how that can actually be simplified much more so. Okay, so task 2.3, it's now using that factory pattern to create an object. And this is where we're going to create a VLAN object and validate it using this factory approach. So this is a bit of a, we're putting aside what we've done previously, but we're still remembering it. Later on in the task 3, we'll actually do a comparison direct to really look into it. But for now, we're just going to kind of keep that in the back, and now we're going to learn the pyaoscx factory way. And so earlier we had this line over here that we didn't really use previously. This is actually importing pyaoscx factory. This way we can create a factory of objects that are automatically applied to the switch without the need of using that apply method. And so earlier when we used apply, it pushed it to the switch. Well, by utilizing factories, this is kind of what I was talking about earlier, to where you are simplifying the code and letting the kind of the subclasses determine whether or not you need to actually create these objects. So one thing I also here is note that when using this approach, if you were to use a factory to create VLAN 200 again, it won't error out with a 500 response as that previous method did, because the factory itself is giving that interface to kind of have that check whether or not the object is already instantiated. However, don't let this stop you from adding some validation logic if you wanted to, as we did previously, just to kind of stretch some of that Python muscle. And so we'll see over here that all this is still the same. But now let's look into this try section. This try section for creating a factory seems a lot smaller because first we're doing a get, which is what we have done previously. That's the same. But now we're actually creating this factory variable called factory, and we're basically passing in the session object, and that's essentially how you have this factory. And so from here, we're now doing a factory.VLAN. So this is actually how you're creating a VLAN object for VLAN ID 200. And then we're going to print it. So we can see that it's a lot simpler. We didn't do any checks, but let's run it and see what happens, right? So by clicking play here, I can see that it logged into the switch, saw the current list. I still have the 100 from previously. Now we have 200, right? And so just like that, we have multiple different VLANs, and it was a lot easier, a lot faster, right? So there is one more caveat that I'll give to this factory method, and that has to do with the way that we have the Jupyter Notebook, and that the Python 3 kernel of Jupyter Notebook, if you run this specific code multiple times, you might see an error. And so I'm going to run it just to show you. Cannot create another pyaoscx factory class. So for this pyaoscx v2, we made it so you can only have one instantiation of the factory. And there's several reasons behind the design concept for doing that. And if you have this in your own script on your PC, you're not going to run into this. But because we have this kernel that's constantly running, it's keeping all the variables and instantiated all on its own, which is separate from what the actual switch and OVA information is. This is why you run into this exception. Basically, if you were to clear the kernel information by restarting the kernel as an example, this is actually a way to kind of re-kickstart and re-clear all of the kernel information. And so this is kind of a quirk of our workshop over here on Jupyter Notebook. But if you have this on like PyCharm or your own IDE, you shouldn't run into this as you're running it multiple times. But over here, yes.
You can also right-click and select clear all outputs if you want to clear up all the different outputs from different cells you run, and if you want to have a clear, you see in the list here, you have clear outputs or clear all outputs. So if you run this, you will remove all the outputs from the cells you run. And if for the people who are running the workshop, if you go onto the file menu on the top left, you will see that you have the possibility to run an export notebook as, if you go down the list, and this will allow you to actually export the content of the notebook and download it locally on your machine. So either as PDF or any type of documentation or format you're willing to use.
Excellent, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so a couple different options. Just make sure that as you're going through this, if you want to restart or rerun this, that utilizes factories where you're essentially trying to create another factory every time you run it, you'll have to restart or clear those that kernel information. And so if I run it now, yes.
There is a question for you from Jenik. How can we encrypt the switch password?
Great question. And so there's actually a Python module and a library which is not a part of pyaoscx v2, but there are essentially different ways to encrypt the password, and so it won't show plain text, especially in here. However, for the purposes of the Jupyter Notebook and the way that we have it auto-generates passwords based off of your registration, we didn't want to implement that over here. But so there are libraries and examples of how to do that, and later I'll show you. Before we go, I'll show you the Aruba Developer Hub, and that should have some information examples along that as well. So, but yes, there are ways to encrypt the switch password as well as encrypt as you're making these SSH sessions and such. Cool. Yeah, so this time I ran it again, and no error because I restarted the kernel in that aspect. So that's just a little quirk to keep in mind. So yeah, as I mentioned, imperative factory, using the factory design pattern, very simplified, much simplified. As I mentioned, I didn't need to put any conditionals. I didn't need to check if this exists, update it, delete it if that happens. No, in fact, I could just run this again and again, and it would still just give you, it'll still push that information to the switch a-okay. So yeah, and if I were to compare the lines of code to the previous one, there's this one's got many more lines of code because of all the conditionals, because of all that information that we're having. So finally, for the last task, this is a comparison between those approaches. And instead of doing just VLANs, I wanted to make it more interesting. I wanted to basically add ports to a lag, link aggregation group and stuff. And so this is where I'll show you the way that we do it via open granulated approach, and then I'll show you the way that we do it with the factory approach. And so just to walk through this code really fast, there isn't any input that you need to, but I wanted to bring this up as an example also of anything you want to change, right? So in the open granulated approach, we're creating an interface object, calling it lag, and we're giving that name of lag3, right? And so similar to what we had before, I'm validating to make sure that, hey, it's not already existing because this is a logical interface. And if it doesn't exist, apply it, push it, make it so we're creating this lag. If it does exist, which is the else over here, then gather that information of that currently existing lag and apply it to this instance of the object. That way, no matter what we're making a lag3, and if it exists, we're giving it all the current information on the switch for that lag. Next, I'm going to check if all the VLANs exist and do something similar with the VLAN 100. If it doesn't exist, I want to apply it. So this is exactly like our previous exercises that we've done. And we're going to take the VLAN information of 100 and get it just like that. Next, I'm going to make an interface for 115. So earlier I showed you that, all right, anytime that we want to kind of apply and make changes to the VLANs, we got to get that information that's currently on there. Same thing with interfaces. We're getting the information for interface 115 on this OVA, on the switch, and getting that information. And now we're directly making changes to the attributes of that, of the lag that we created earlier. So for lag 3, I want to make sure that its admin is up. I want to make it a routing lag, and I want to make it a VLAN 100, essentially a VLAN for that lag. We'll LACP passive, VLAN mode native untagged, and tag it for VLAN 100. So that way we have it as not only a trunk VLAN, but it'll be tagged with that VLAN 100. And finally, we'll add this port as a lag member by making sure that, hey, if the interfaces on that lag object is, if it's empty, then we're making its own interface, and we're appending that port earlier. So this port interface 115, I'm making sure that I am now appending it to this interface list. So interfaces is an attribute list, or list of attributes, I should say. An attribute that is a list, I should say, of interfaces for that lag. And now we're making sure that port 115 is now a part of that. Finally, we're applying it. So this is actually what's pushing that lag information there. And then we're doing a get to make sure that, hey, we're making a temporary variable, doing a get on that lag, seeing what the interface name is, and et cetera, et cetera. So this is essentially to create a lag, update it with create a VLAN if it doesn't already exist, update it to that lag, put an interface 115 to the lag, pushing it, and then running it. So there we go. Now we can see as output goes, if I can search for a list of all the interfaces, we have all these dictionary keys. These are all the different interfaces that are available on this OVA. And as part of interfaces, we don't actually see a lag. So that allows us to make it. Check and switch for all the VLANs. I see that there is a 100 and 200 at this point. And now I did the apply, and now I show that of the lag 3 interfaces, it now has a 115. And so this is, a way that we can essentially do it. And so if we run this again, because of the conditionals that we put, it still runs, except the main difference is it's bypassing any of the parts to where we actually needed to, and just gets it from the previous information. So this is
Alvin?
Yes.
If I may interrupt you, there is one question from Vashni Krishna, and sorry if I'm pronouncing bad your name. What is the command script or /script for breakout?
If you mean like a control C type of situation to break out of like sort of like an endless loop. Actually, I'm not familiar with that on the Jupyter Notebook. I haven't run into that. Usually I would control C if it was my own thing. Fred, do you have the answer to that one?
So, you mean like interrupting the run run of a script?
Yeah.
So, well, I mean, if you're running a bash, I mean, you see, you're using a Python kernel. If you were to use a bash kernel, there is no, apart from interrupting the kernel, I don't think you can actually break out of a command. So if the command loops forever, then you will see that whenever you are running a cell, there is a star at the top right left of the cell that shows you that the cell is running. Okay, and as long as you don't get a number, a digit, it means that the cell can run forever. So if your script has no end, then it will run forever. But VAMC is precising interface split, so maybe it makes more sense to you.
Yeah, VAMC, I think I might need to connect with you after this, just for the time's sake. Michael Rose definitely put in some information to hit a letter I to interrupt when in command mode, escape and such. So that also is something I haven't tried. So that's a great way. Thank you, Michael, for bringing that up. But yeah, also Vamsi, if there is some code information that you're yet curious or questions on, let's connect after, and we'll see what that's about.
5 minutes left.
Yep. So as an example, if you had access to that switch CLI, you did a show running config, your output should show similar to this, to where you have the VLAN 100 with a name, VLAN 100 as you put. You'll have interface lag 3, and you'll see that interface 113 has that information. So, VLAN trunk native 100, and 115 lag 3, just like that. So this is, if you do a show run right there. So this was the way to do the open granulated approach to do all this. Now let's compare this to the factory pattern, and we'll see it's much simpler and much cleaner in this case, right? Because with factories, we're just creating a factory, creating a lag. We're going to use a lag 2 in this case. And in that lag2.configure L2 method, we could actually pass in the parameters that we want to edit, that we want to change. And so you have the capability to modify these, with this configure L2 right from the start. And so if I were to, I'll restart the kernel simply because of the factory right here, and hit play here. And just like that, much smaller output too, because we didn't have a lot of if-then conditionals and statements. But we can see that we have configured L2 for the physical port 114 and gave it a description, put it up, native untagged, set native VLAN to be true, etc. And we then created a temporary lag, ran a get to gather that information, and then we printed out what interfaces are part of that lag. And that's where we see that lag 2, which we have created, has 114. And so if we were to look at the CLI command, if you had access to it with the show running, it'll look similar to this, to where we have now that lag 3 from previous, we have a lag 2, and that lag 2 is applied to 114 versus the lag 3 is applied to 105 from the previous example. So this is where you can see there are pros and cons to using both. Basically, it does allow you to have, a simpler fashion when we're having such a large configuration and changes that we want to be made. However, if you want just direct access to the attributes, one quick attribute change like voice VLAN, things like that, the open granulated approach is a great way to quickly do that. So congratulations on completing this session. I know that this was kind of a lot. Definitely reach out to me if you have any questions. Again, I mentioned that the Aruba Developer Hub, developer.arubanetworks.com, is a great place to have information for all of our automation on the Aruba side. We have CX as well as wireless aspects over there.
Please, and just before leaving, we would like you to fill up this survey that I pulled up in a Zoom session. So it's very quick. There are a few questions you need to go through, whether it was a good use of your time, the technical level, and recommending DevTalks to some other of your colleagues. And if you'd like to see some subjects to be covered in the future, please make them or type them in the chat, and we'll thank you for your attendance. I mean, it's great to see some newcomers in the community. So hopefully you found that the Jupyter notebooks and the DevTalks that we are delivering were a good use of your time, and that they were relevant to you. There were a few questions in the chat regarding some possible Ansible playbooks that should come up in the future. So I answered the question, Alvin, telling them that you're already working on this and it should be available in the coming months, I would say. In the last minute of the session, there was also a question about the Aruba network, the developer Aruba network website. Was it updated to reflect the new capabilities of this library, of this pyaoscx2?
Currently the CX side of Developer Aruba Hub, we have the latest API, which is v10.08, and we are changing more and more content to use pyaoscx v2. At least for the pyaoscx side. All the other stuff like the Ansible, all that has been updated as well. So check it out, see what other updates are there.
There was one question from VJ as well. Does it support asyncio? Oh, read it in the chat. Asyncio library.
Asyncio library. pyaoscx v2 shouldn't have any issues with that particular library, but I haven't ran it in my scripts myself.
Okay, there was one question from Raphael, from Vemsme. No, sorry, who is this? Jorge, who wanted to know more about Ansible. So the HP Dev team is working on an Ansible 101, and as I said, Alvin and his team is also working on an Ansible-based workshop that would be related to CX and the configuration of CX switches throughout Ansible, I'm pretty sure.
Yes, we have Ansible Galaxy support for
Yeah.
RCX switches. And like I said, you could get a lot of information on this developer hub if you click on this Ansible section to get started. And yeah, this will help you out. As well as, like Fred said, we'll look forward to future Ansible hack checks.
Okay. So thanks for everyone attending the session. I will end up with this one only slide that you need to know about. And if you want to learn about the HP Dev community, if you want to join the community, your first step will be to join this hpedev.io website, where everything will be open to you, from the workshops, the different communities, the blogs, and the different registration endpoints to some of our dev talks on Mensch and Learn. With that being said, I will wish you a very good end of your day, and thanks again, Alvin. This was a great session. All the people in the chat were, I think, very happy attending it, and they are actually saying well done to you. So it's a great job, and I'll be very happy to host other sessions with you, maybe in a month or so, with new subjects coming from Aruba. So the more there will be, and the better it will be for everyone. So thanks again, and have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.